Building 6,903 sites on the eastern edge of Fort Campbell, Kentucky, where Warrior Transition Battalion processes soldiers whose bodies and minds have been shattered by combat deployments that military medicine can patch but never fully repair. Dr. Malcolm Hendricks has spent 23 years conducting group therapy in rooms like this one, watching veterans struggle with invisible wounds that don't show up on any scan or X-ray, wounds that kill slowly through suicide and addiction, rather than through immediate violence that created them in first place. Thursday afternoon, October 2nd, 2025, at 13:58 hours, Hendricks sits in his usual chair facing the door and watches Chief Warrant Officer 3 Sloane Kensington take her customary position in corner furthest from him. She's been coming to these sessions for 3 weeks now, same chair every time, same oversized army hoodie despite Kentucky heat, same single word spoken when he calls attendance. Her intake file contains usual post-deployment markers, USASOC assignment with heavy redactions, classified mission parameters, helicopter crash in Afghanistan resulting in traumatic brain injury, and severe PTSD, medical board recommendation for psychiatric treatment before any return to duty considerations. The other veterans filter in with their own damage worn openly or hidden carefully, depending on personality and coping mechanisms. Staff Sergeant Deshaun Brooks arrives first as always, moving with precise economy of motion that comes from 12 years with 101st Airborne Division, hands tremoring slightly as he grips his water bottle. He takes chair to Hendricks's right, positioning himself with clear sight lines to both exits and no windows at his back. Tactical awareness that kept him alive in Kandahar convoy ambush, now making civilian life feel like constant low-level threat assessment. Specialist Mei Lin Park enters next, moving with careful deliberation of someone whose inner ear no longer provides reliable information about which way is up. The IED blast outside Mosul scrambled her vestibular system and left her with chronic vertigo that makes world feel permanently tilted. Sergeant First Class Marcus Reeves served 3 tours with 5th Special Forces Group and now can't sleep more than 90 minutes without night terrors jerking him awake in defensive crouch. Private First Class Jennifer Cole survived 11 straight hours of sustained small arms fire, and now any sudden loud noise triggers automatic response that drops her into cover position. Captain Thomas Ridgway lost his entire platoon to suicide bomber at checkpoint and carries survivor's guilt like physical weight. Warrant Officer Junior Grade Brixton. Hayes defused 47 IEDs before the 48th one detonated prematurely and took most of his hearing along with chunks of memory from traumatic brain injury. Corporal Yolanda Martinez arrives with service dog Atlas, who provides both emotional support and practical assistance for mobility issues from vehicle rollover that crushed her pelvis. Staff Sergeant Lionel Crawford was crew chief on CEH-47 Chinooks before helicopter crash during training exercise resulted in compression fractures to 3 vertebrae and nerve damage. Then Sergeant Ethan Vance stumbles through door apologizing about getting lost again. Traumatic brain injury from Kunar Province helicopter crash, having left him with memory deficits that frustrate him more than burn scars covering his hands from pulling at cockpit wreckage, trying to reach his pilot who didn't make it out before fire spread. Sloane watches Vance's scarred hands with expression that shifts from carefully maintained neutrality to something that might be recognition, because her own hands show different scars, calluses and marks that come from thousands of hours gripping collective and cyclic controls in helicopters most people don't know exist. Session begins with check-ins, each veteran sharing their week in brief, painful summaries. When check-in reaches Sloane, she offers her standard contribution in voice so soft those across circle have to lean forward. Present. One word barely audible that fulfills minimum requirement while revealing nothing about her internal state. But what none of them knew was that in 37 minutes, Sloane would be forced to reveal everything she'd spent months hiding since the crash. Hendricks leads them through grounding techniques designed to interrupt trauma responses when flashbacks threaten to overwhelm present reality. Progressive muscle relaxation, where you deliberately tense and release muscle groups to break body's stress response cycle. Deep breathing exercises that activate parasympathetic nervous system to counteract fight or flight arousal. Sensory awareness practices that anchor consciousness in immediate surroundings by engaging all 5 senses with present environment. Group practices together, each person engaging with varying degrees of success and skepticism. Sloane participates mechanically, but breathing exercises trigger memories she's been suppressing since March 15th. Each controlled breath pulls her incrementally closer to Afghanistan nights, to smell of aviation fuel mixed with hydraulic fluid, to distinctive sound pattern of twin turboshaft engines at flight idle, to vibration of composite rotor blades cutting through thin mountain air at 8,000 feet. Her right hand moves unconsciously in small circular motions against her left palm, muscle memory working invisible controls that her conscious mind refuses to acknowledge. The collective pitch control that adjusted rotor blade angle, cyclic stick that controlled aircraft attitude, pedals that manage directional control through tail rotor authority. 3 years of Night Stalker training and 5 years of operational flying had burned those movements into neural pathways that wouldn't fade just because flight surgeons had grounded her permanently. 37 minutes into session, Vance begins showing signs of distress that Hendricks recognizes immediately. His breathing pattern changes first, becoming shallower and faster, rhythm shifting from controlled exercise to involuntary stress response. His eyes lose focus on present room, gaze growing distant as if he's looking at something invisible to everyone else, something only he can see from memory that won't release him. Hendricks begins standard intervention protocol, speaking in calm, measured tones designed to anchor consciousness in present moment. This is Fort Campbell, Kentucky. This is Thursday afternoon. This is therapy room. Everyone here is safe. But Vance has already gone too deep into flashback, pulled into memory of crash that killed his pilot months ago during brownout landing in Kunar province. His conscious mind fully convinced it's reliving those terrible minutes in real time, rather than sitting safely in therapy room. Sloane watches his deterioration with recognition that goes beyond professional observation. She knows every stage of what he's experiencing because she's lived it herself, because she still lives it 3 or 4 times a week when something triggers her own memories, and suddenly she's back in Paktika province with transmission temperature climbing into red arc and Derek Castellano running emergency checklists in right seat, while she fights to keep dying aircraft in air long enough to save 15 wounded operators in cargo bay. Vance's hands begin moving through practiced motions, checking imaginary instruments, working non-existent controls, his body remembering what his mind can't escape. Muscle memory of crew chief monitoring aircraft systems during emergency situations, calling out critical information with professional discipline, even as everything falls apart. His breathing accelerates toward hyperventilation, words beginning to escape in fragments. Altitude-dropping controls not responding need more collective pitch, desperate technical language of aviation emergencies spoken by someone whose brain believes he's living through it again right now. Then he mentions RPG impact and hydraulic failure, and Sloane's entire body goes rigid because she knows exactly where this is going, knows sequence of events that follow those words, knows what comes next because she's lived through variations of this scenario more times than she can count. Vance is already gone, pulled into memory of crash that killed his pilot. And Sloane recognizes every symptom because she still wakes up 3 times a week in her Clarksville apartment covered in sweat, while her mind insists she's still in that burning aircraft trying to reach Derek while operators pull her away from flames. Vance's flashback intensifies, his voice rising toward panic as he describes aircraft going down, crew chief calling to pilot about imminent crash, desperate communication between crew members who know they're about to hit ground hard. Words tumble out faster, losing coherence as fear overwhelms language. Sloane makes decision that goes against months of careful concealment. She stands up in one fluid motion and crosses circle with purpose, moving with confidence of someone who's done this before, who's talked people through emergencies when panic would have killed everyone involved. She kneels directly in front of Vance at eye level, entering his field of vision in a way that can't be ignored. When she speaks, her voice carries authority she hasn't used since the night Derek Castellano died in burning helicopter 23 kilometers from FOB Sharana. The words that come out are pure aviation protocol, structured communication patterns used in military helicopter operations, call and response format that provides cognitive anchors during crisis situations. She identifies herself as pilot, instructs him to maintain auto-rotation procedure, requests specific information about aircraft systems and altitude. Her voice cuts through Vance's panic like blade through tissue. It carries absolute certainty of someone who knows exactly what she's talking about, who's lived through this scenario for real, who understands that only way to talk someone down from flashback about aircraft emergencies is to walk them through procedures step by step until their training overrides their terror. Room watches in stunned silence as Sloane guides Vance through imaginary emergency landing using terminology and procedures that reveal extensive professional knowledge of helicopter operations. She's not guessing or improvising. She's executing practiced skill set that comes from thousands of hours of real flight experience. Vance's breathing begins to slow as his mind latches onto familiar structure of emergency procedures, training that operates below conscious thought, muscle memory that provides cognitive framework even in middle of psychological crisis. Call and response continues, altitude callouts and obstacle warnings and gentle touchdown, each step reinforcing present reality through language of aviation operations until Vance finally blinks and awareness returns to his eyes. He realizes he's sitting in therapy room at Fort Campbell rather than plummeting toward Afghan mountains. His first confused question about whether they landed safely receives Sloane's calm confirmation that mission is complete and all crew are safe. Professional demeanor she maintains even as she can feel 11 pairs of eyes staring at her with expressions ranging from shock to confusion to something approaching awe. She returns to her chair with hunched shoulders and downcast eyes, confidence that animated her features for 3 minutes, draining away completely as she realizes what she's just done. How much she's revealed. How impossible it will be to maintain anonymity now that she's demonstrated skills that only come from one very specific background. For months since the crash, she'd stayed invisible, just another broken veteran processing trauma in government-approved therapy sessions. But now, in 3 minutes, she'd revealed skills that only one unit in entire army possessed. Expertise that marked her as surely as if she'd walked in wearing dress uniform with Night Stalker insignia on sleeve. Hendricks struggles to process what he's witnessed. This woman who'd barely spoken for 3 weeks, suddenly demonstrating flawless crisis intervention using highly specific aviation expertise. His questions come carefully, aware that every word matters, that she's balanced on edge between opening up and retreating completely back behind walls, "How did you know what to do?" he asks. And Sloane's response comes reluctantly. She admits that she'd recognized scenario from her own experience, that she'd been in that exact situation before, not as observer, but as participant. Questions continue with progressive narrowing. What kind of aircraft? What position? Each answer pulling her closer to revelation she's been avoiding since March 15th. Not Chinooks, not Blackhawks, not Apaches. Finally, admission that comes out barely audible. MH-47G Special Operations Variant. Reeves goes completely still because he's 5th Special Forces Group, and he knows exactly what that designation means. MH-47G is exclusively flown by 161st Special Operations Aviation Regiment, Night Stalkers, pilots who conduct military's most dangerous missions in conditions where conventional aviation won't operate. They took SEAL Team 6 into Abbottabad, fly Delta Force into denied territory, conduct operations so classified their existence is rarely acknowledged even decades afterward. Room's energy transforms completely because even among elite military veterans, Night Stalkers hold mythical status. These are pilots who fly special operations forces into impossible situations and somehow get them out again, who operate in conditions that would ground any conventional unit, who accept casualty rates most aviators couldn't psychologically handle. Hendricks uses her full rank for first time. Chief Warrant Officer Kensington, formal acknowledgement of military status she's been trying to shed since the crash. He asks directly whether she was flying Night Stalker missions when incident occurred that led to her assignment here. Her minimal nod confirms everything, but reveals nothing about specifics. Operational security constraints prevent her from discussing details, even now, even in therapy, even when keeping silent is destroying her from inside. She admits that people died because of decisions she made as aircraft commander, that their lives were her direct responsibility, that she failed them. Words come out ragged and broken because she's carried this guilt alone with nobody to share the weight. Vance asks what happened to her aircraft, and something breaks inside Sloane. Months of suppression fail all at once, dam crumbling and words flooding out in rush she can't control anymore. Paktika Province, Afghanistan. March 15th, 2023, 0247 hours local time. Emergency medevac extraction mission for 2 critically wounded Delta Force operators whose team had been ambushed during reconnaissance operation in Taliban-controlled territory. Images flood back with sensory clarity that makes present reality fade to background noise. She's pulled back into cockpit of her MH-47G, hands on controls, Derek Castellano in right seat, running pre-landing checks. Afghan night visible through night vision goggles appears as green-tinted landscape of mountains and valleys that has killed so many pilots who made even tiny mistakes. They were inbound to hot landing zone with enemy forces in area. Time critical because both wounded operators were bleeding out and needed surgical intervention within golden hour, or they'd die regardless of how good was. First RPG impact against tail boom section felt as much as heard. Distinctive thump of shaped charge warhead detonating against composite airframe. Caution panel immediately lit up with warnings that transmission oil pressure was dropping in aft gearbox system. Derek's voice calm and professional on internal communications calling out problem. No panic because Night Stalker training emphasized maintaining professional discipline even when aircraft was being shot out from under you. Even when every instinct screamed to panic because metal was failing and enemy was trying to kill you, and 15 lives in cargo bay depended on you keeping composure together. Second RPG hit left fuselage near forward cabin, hydraulic system compromised. Primary flight controls degraded from powered response to manual backup that required much more physical force to manipulate, aircraft handling getting mushy and unpredictable as pressure bled out of system. Third RPG impact against aft rotor pylon assembly caused damage to transmission itself, not just support systems, but actual mechanical component that transferred engine power to rotor blades that kept them airborne. That's when everything changed from manageable emergency to catastrophic failure. Derek ran emergency checklist while she fought to keep aircraft in air. Transmission temperature climbed steadily into red arc on gauge, exceeding operational limits, metal components grinding against each other without proper lubrication, generating heat that would eventually cause complete seizure. They were 23 kilometers from FOB Sharana, but transmission temperature was climbing at rate that meant they had maybe 90 seconds before complete mechanical failure, certainly not the minutes needed to reach forward operating base. Derek's voice suggested immediate landing in nearest clear area, following standard emergency procedure. But she calculated instantly what that would mean. Taliban-controlled territory, enemy forces all around. Nearest clear area was small valley surrounded by high ground that would give enemy tactical advantage. If they landed there with 2 critically wounded operators and no quick reaction force immediately available, they'd be overrun within minutes. Everyone captured or killed. Mission total failure. Math was brutal, but simple. Keep flying beyond aircraft limits, accept that transmission would eventually fail catastrophically, try to get close enough to friendly lines that ground forces could reach them, even if helicopter went down. Trade certain mechanical failure for possibility of mission success. Derek processed her decision in silence for maybe 3 seconds, then his voice came back with words that would haunt her forever after. Push it, Sloan. Get them home. Not an order because aircraft commanders made final decisions, not suggestion because he knew stakes as well as she did, just acknowledgement that he understood what she was choosing and why. That he supported decision even though it would probably kill them both. She pushed aircraft beyond every operational limit. Transmission temperature climbed to 620 degrees, bearing assemblies grinding themselves to death, metallic, shrieking audible over engine noise. Caution panel completely illuminated with warnings that screamed at them to land immediately before catastrophic failure. At 8,400 feet above ground level aft, transmission seized completely. Total mechanical failure. All power to aft rotor system lost instantly. Aircraft transitioning from controlled flight to barely controlled descent in space of single heartbeat. Airframe started shaking violently as asymmetric forces tried to tear it apart. Forward rotor still turning under power while aft rotor was locked solid. Aerodynamic stresses exceeding design specifications. Composite materials flexing beyond their structural limits. She spotted small clearing ahead, barely large enough for their rotor diameter. No time for proper landing approach, no time to reduce speed gradually, just desperate attempt to reach that clearing before aircraft disintegrated around them, or they lost too much altitude and hit mountains. Full collective pull at last second trying to arrest descent. Aft cyclic to flare nose up and kill forward velocity. But with aft transmission seized aircraft wasn't responding like it should. Control inputs having unexpected results. Because aerodynamic model had changed completely with loss of aft rotor authority. Impact was catastrophic. Fuselage breaking into 2 sections at cargo ramp. Forward section containing cockpit separated from aft section containing cargo bay and operators, metal screaming as it tore apart. Sloane's spine compressed as vertebrae absorbed impact forces, and 3 discs herniated instantly, sending signals of damage that her brain couldn't process yet because adrenaline was overriding everything else. Derek wasn't moving. His side of cockpit had taken worst impact. Instrument panel had collapsed inward into space where he was sitting. She called his name. Kept calling his name, but got no response, no movement, nothing but terrible silence from right seat. Operators in back were screaming, some trapped under equipment that had broken loose during impact, some wounded from crash on top of wounds they'd already sustained during ambush. She had to get them out, had to move now because aircraft was leaking fuel everywhere, and they were still taking small arms fire from enemy positions maybe 200 meters away. She pulled operators out one by one, 15 men total. Some walked under their own power, some being dragged by their teammates, all of them getting clear of wreckage while she kept going back for more, because that's what aircraft commanders did. You got your people out before you worried about yourself. 2 critically wounded operators still needed immediate medical attention she couldn't provide. Their original injuries compounded now by crash trauma. But they were alive and conscious, and ground extraction team was already inbound because she'd gotten them close enough to friendly lines that quick reaction force could reach them in minutes instead of never. She went back for Derek, still strapped in his seat with instrument panel pinning him. Tried to pull him free, yanked at twisted metal with hands that were already injured from crash, fought against wreckage while operators grabbed her and pulled her away. They told her aircraft was going to explode. They had to fall back to defensive position. They couldn't stay here. She fought them, kept trying to reach Derek, but they physically carried her away from burning aircraft while she screamed his name. 30 seconds later, fuel tanks ignited and fireball mushroomed up into Afghan night, consuming everything, including Derek Castellano, who'd told her to push it, who'd given her permission to destroy aircraft if it meant saving mission, who'd trusted her judgment even when that judgment led directly to his death. She'd saved 15 lives that night, including both critically wounded operators who eventually recovered and returned to duty. But she'd failed to save the one that mattered most, co-pilot who'd flown with her for 2 years, who'd trusted her completely, who'd died because she'd made decision to keep flying when procedure said, land immediately. Therapy room sits in heavy silence after Sloane finishes. Months of suppressed grief and guilt, finally released in flood of words that leaves her shaking and crying in her chair, while 11 veterans and 1 psychologist process story of impossible choices made under unimaginable pressure. Brooks speaks first with question that cuts through emotional weight, asking how many operators made it home alive because of what she did. Forcing her to acknowledge that all 15 survived, including both critically wounded, forcing her to confront mathematics of her decision, even as her guilt insists she should have done something different. His follow-up comes firm and direct, statement rather than question. She'd made split-second decision under impossible circumstances that saved 17 lives minimum. She'd pushed aircraft beyond design limits, knowing she'd probably crash, but calculating that getting closer to friendly lines gave everyone best chance of survival. This wasn't failure, but extraordinary courage under worst circumstances imaginable. Reeves adds perspective from Special Forces background, explaining that Derek was doing exact same mission she was, taking exact same risks. Every Night Stalker understands stakes and makes peace with them before first operational flight. Nobody flies for SOAR thinking they're guaranteed to come home. Mission always comes first, and Derek knew that as well as anyone. Sloane tries to protest that she can't fly anymore. Flight surgeons won't medically clear her. She failed every psychological evaluation. She can't maintain proper focus on instruments. She has flashbacks whenever she hears rotor noise or smells aviation fuel. Everything defining her identity for past years is gone completely. Hendricks acknowledges current reality that she can't fly, but asks whether 10 minutes ago she would have described herself as capable of helping another person through crisis, forcing her to admit she'd thought herself broken and useless, forcing her to recognize that when she saw Vance in distress, she'd intervened automatically using exact same skills that made her Night Stalker pilot. Crawford suddenly sits forward with expression showing recognition. Asking about Paktika Province on March 15th, 2023, explaining he was crew chief on lead Chinook in Quick Reaction Force that responded to crash site. Details tumble out now from different perspective. Crawford describing how they'd found MH-47G broken in 2 pieces and completely burned out. Intel had said total loss with no survivors. They'd thought everyone died until they found defensive positions and blood trails showing multiple wounded being moved under fire. He explains they'd tracked those trails and found where extraction team had picked up operators and 1 flight crew member 400 meters from crash site. His pilot had said it was most remarkable piece of flying he'd ever seen, getting aircraft that close to friendly lines after taking multiple RPG hits and losing transmission. Nobody could believe aircraft commander had survived, let alone managed to extract all 15 operators before explosion. Crawford looks directly at Sloan, telling her that Command Sergeant Major Williams, whose team she'd saved, has been asking about pilot since March. Williams knows aircraft went down trying to extract his wounded, but Intel told him there were no survivors. It would mean everything to him to know she's alive. The following Thursday arrives with autumn chill settling over Fort Campbell. At 13:53 hours, Sloan walks into Building 69037 minutes early, first time she's been early for anything since the crash. She takes chair in middle of circle, rather than isolating herself near emergency exit. When Hendricks calls attendance and reaches her name, she looks around at other faces in circle and speaks clearly for first time since joining group. She says she's here, and she's grateful to be here with all of them. 13 words instead of her usual single word. Small thing that represents enormous progress in context of trauma recovery. During session, she participates actively in discussions, sharing her experiences when relevant and listening attentively when others speak. Transformation from 3 weeks of silence to genuine engagement that Hendricks notes as significant therapeutic breakthrough. After session ends, Sloan joins Vance Crawford Park and Brooks for coffee at Small Cafe in Clarksville. First time since March, she's accepted social invitation. First time she's allowed people to get close instead of maintaining careful isolation that had become her default mode. 2 weeks pass, with Sloan attending every session and slowly rebuilding connections she'd severed after the crash. Then comes the day she drives to Fort Campbell's Special Operations Compound for meeting she's spent days preparing herself for mentally. Williams meets her in small conference room and renders crisp salute moment she walks through door. Formal acknowledgement that brings tears to her eyes because nobody's saluted her since the night Derek died. They sit across from each other, and Williams speaks about how he's been searching for her since March 15th. Intel told him there were no survivors from Medevac Bird that extracted his team. He spent months believing pilots who saved his team were dead. He tells her his team had been compromised during reconnaissance operation, took heavy casualties during ambush. 2 operators bleeding out with combat medics saying they had maybe 40 minutes before they'd die, while normal medevac timeline was 70 to 90 minutes given their location. When they heard her bird inbound taking RPG hits, everyone thought medevac was aborting because nobody keeps flying after taking multiple hits. But she kept coming, flew damaged aircraft into hot landing zone and lifted off while still taking fire. Williams explains both wounded operators survived because she bought them those extra minutes. Got surgical intervention within 53 minutes. Both made full recovery and back on active duty now. Staff Sergeant Marcus Delgado, getting married next month. Sergeant First Class James Rivera, whose daughter was born 4 months ago. These men alive because she made impossible choice. When Sloan protests about Derek, Williams tells her Derek was Night Stalker, same as her. Understood mission parameters, same as her, chose mission over safety when he told her to push it because that's what Special Operations Forces do. Mission first, always. In the weeks that follow, Williams's words begin to shift something inside Sloan. Not erasing the pain or guilt, but reframing it in a way that makes it possible to carry. She accepts position with Warrior Transition Battalion as peer support specialist, working with veterans struggling with PTSD and traumatic injuries. On Tuesday afternoon, she meets with new arrival, young Apache pilot named Captain Rebecca Torres, who'd been shot down in Syria 3 months earlier. Torres sits rigid, telling her that weapons officer died, that she was aircraft commander, and his life was her responsibility. If she'd been better pilot, maybe he'd still be alive. Sloan tells Torres about Derek Castellano, about impossible choice between following procedure and saving mission, about months of guilt before learning that operators survived because she'd made choice that killed Derek, about understanding that sometimes there are no good options, only terrible choices and worse ones. Torres asks how you live with knowing someone died because of your decisions, and Sloan answers carefully. You live with it by understanding your weapons officer made same choice you did, volunteered for combat aviation, accepting risks. You honor his sacrifice by using your experience to help others, by building something meaningful from the loss. 6 months after that first breakthrough in group therapy, Sloan stands before military families at Fort Campbell's annual Memorial Day ceremony. Asked to speak about service and sacrifice, about invisible wounds that continue long after visible ones heal. Looking out at assembled crowd, she sees Williams sitting front row with his family, sees Vance and Crawford throughout audience, sees families of fallen service members wearing gold star pins. She puts aside prepared notes and speaks from deeper place about Derek, who told her to push it and get operators home, who supported decision he knew would probably kill them both, because mission mattered more than personal safety. The people we honor today didn't die because we failed them, she continues. They died because they volunteered to stand between evil and innocence, because they chose mission over safety, because they believed some things are worth dying for. Our job as survivors isn't to carry guilt that crushes us under its weight. Our job is to live lives worthy of sacrifice they made, to support each other through darkness that follows loss, to transform our pain into purpose that honors their memory. She talks about invisible wounds, about PTSD and survivor's guilt that can be as debilitating as any physical injury, about the importance of accepting help instead of suffering in isolation, of building connections with others who understand because they've walked similar paths through trauma, about learning that healing doesn't mean forgetting those we've lost, but rather finding ways to carry their memory forward that give meaning to both their sacrifice and our survival. The deepest wounds often come not from what was done to us, but from what we believe we failed to do, she tells them. From decisions we second-guess endlessly in the darkness of sleepless nights, from responsibility we carry for outcomes that were beyond our control in the chaos of combat. Healing doesn't mean forgetting or minimizing those we've lost. Healing means accepting that we did our best under impossible circumstances, that our fallen comrades made their choices understanding the costs, that we honor them by living fully instead of dying slowly from guilt that serves no one. We measure military service in medals and ribbons and years of dedication, but real measure is simpler and harder than any of those markers. Did we do our duty when called upon? Did we make hard choices when easier choices would have failed the mission? Did we support our brothers and sisters when they needed us most? Every person we remember today answered yes to those questions with their lives. We honor them by answering yes with how we choose to live ours. That evening she walks to parking lot after ceremony, gets into car, and helicopter flies overhead conducting training mission. Sound of rotors causes automatic tension response in her body that months of therapy haven't fully eliminated. But this time she stops, breathes, uses grounding techniques she's learned and taught to others, acknowledges fear without letting it control her, waits until rotor noise fades into Kentucky evening before starting her car. On dashboard sits photograph of her and Derek at Night Stalker graduation 3 years earlier. Both young and confident, and certain they could handle anything the Army threw at them, before they learned some missions cost everything, before they understood that survival sometimes meant living with choices that would haunt you forever, carrying losses that never fully healed, but could eventually be integrated into who you became after. She starts car and drives home through Clarksville evening, thinking about Derek and 15 operators and Crawford's quick reaction force and command, Sergeant Major Williams. About all the people whose lives intersected with hers that terrible night in Paktika province, whose stories became woven together through shared trauma and impossible choices made in moments when there was no time for anything except instinct and training and desperate hope. Sound of helicopters still hurt, probably always would, triggering memories and fears she'd carry rest of her life like scars that never quite faded, but became part of the landscape of who she was. But maybe someday, those sounds would remind her of what she'd been, instead of only what she'd lost, would bring back memories of good missions and successful extractions, and all the times she'd brought everyone home safe, instead of only remembering one night when she couldn't save the person who mattered most. She didn't know if that day would ever come, couldn't promise herself it would, could only keep trying day by day to build life worth living from wreckage of life she'd lost. Accepting help from people who understood because they were fighting similar battles, moving forward not because she was healed, but because forward was only direction that made sense anymore. Because Derek had told her to get them home, and she'd honored that command in the only way she could, by surviving and finding purpose in helping others survive their own impossible losses.